Hi everybody, good evening. Welcome to the webinar. Tonight's webinar broadcast is depression, self-harm, and suicide. And I'm going to talk about mostly in terms of our response, because I think you can easily look up the information on what is depression, what is self-harm, and what is suicide in a lot of ways. I'll talk a little bit about that, but a lot of the webinar is more about how to respond to a person who's self-sabotaging in these ways. I changed the title. Originally I was going to talk about self-sabotage and not include suicide, because I've been told this, and I think there's some truth to it, that to tackle the concept of suicide on any level, you can almost never do it justice because of the ramifications and the devastation that it causes in our lives. But I still felt that I wanted to talk about what it's like for those of you who have children who've attempted it, or who are thinking about it, or who might be prone to it. I want to talk about it from that perspective. I won't talk about it a lot from the perspective of if you've suffered through it, because again, I don't know that I could do it justice on this webinar or any webinar for that matter. So with that lead in, let me get right into it tonight. I'm going to talk about kind of the questions that come up around depression. What's the cause of it? We know that there's an organic component. We know that there's a predisposition. We know that people's brains that they release or are not able to absorb in such a way that the chemicals in the brain, the dopamine, the serotonin in the brain, causes depression. It causes the mood to go down. We also know that trauma can cause that. So people are predisposed to it, but also the environment can cause it. And I think that that's a misunderstanding. I think we think of it in terms of what's the nature and what's the nurture, and that's a very distinct line. But what is important to understand is when you're exposed or in a certain kind of environment for a while, you actually can have reduced serotonin in your brain. You can have a reduction in dopamine or cortisol. So those things that happen to us can wire our brain in such a way that we're prone to depression. In some ways, developmentally, it's a challenge because teenagers go through a phase in their life that looks like mild depression for the most part, for a lot of us, right? They're moody, agitated, upset, prone to long periods of feeling discouraged. And so we have to figure out the developmental component of that and to be able to parse that out, because measuring a 5-year-old against a 15-year-old against a 35-year-old on the same scale wouldn't be fair. So it's important to know that. We also know that in teenagers it shows up as anger more often than it does as a depressed mood. We know that. We're going to talk about the secondary and primary gains a few times tonight. Let me define what that is. A primary gain of a behavior is the anxiety reduction that it gives me, right? If I'm feeling nervous and I bite my nails, then I'm putting my nervous energy into something. The secondary gain is the contextual or behavioral response we get from our environment. In other words, if I'm biting my nails and my mother nags me about that or is always criticizing me about that, then I'm getting some attention. So that would be the secondary gain. And with depression, there are primary and secondary gains. One of the greatest challenges I ever had for those who suffered from depression is I would ask them to write a paper on the benefits of being depressed. And they struggled with that. But I was able to point out, one thing that happens when you're depressed is people do lower their bar. They tend to give you attention. You tend to evoke pity from other people, and sometimes people will do more for you, enable you, rescue you from that. So there is, not that anybody does it for that reason consciously, right? They're suffering legitimately from depression, but it's also important for us to understand the systemic features, because that's something we have a lot more control over than the predisposition or the organicity. So it's important to understand that it's not that simple. That I think a lot of parents come to us and they say, just if you could wrap this up for me and explain this, if you could just give me the answer and wrap it up like a package with a bow. But it's a complex thing, multifaceted thing. And we really do want to give the child and the family tools to be able to go through the process of discovery and maintenance themselves. And so I'll talk about that tonight. What's the cure? we know that medication can get people to a point where they can access therapy. Some people are so depressed that they're unable to make use of, at least unmotivated, if not incapable of accessing therapy. The principles in therapy, the assignments in therapy, right? They can't even get in the starting gate, is the way that I say it. But we do know that if you combine therapy with medication, in many cases you have the best outcomes. That's what the research tells us. And some people, if they're less depressed, higher functioning, they might not need medication. So that's something a medical doctor will have to make a decision about. And if you want to take the least intrusive medical option, then you're going to see, can somebody make progress without it? Can they make adequate progress in therapy, any kind of therapeutic setting, without it? And really, at Evoke, that's our policy. Our policy is, if they need it, we're not unilaterally opposed to it or in favor of it. It's a case-by-case situation. We look at the family history. We look at what has worked. This is a very short-term primary intervention in a lot of ways. And so to introduce several variables at once in all cases would be difficult, because you wouldn't know what was having the positive effect. So we're conservative about changing any course when clients and students enter the program. So if they're not on it, we lean toward not starting it unless we see obvious indicators of the need. And if they come in on it, our inclination is, in most cases, not all cases, our inclination is to keep them on the course that they're on. Because we know that going off depression medication, even for somebody not suffering from clinical depression, can cause depression, can trigger depressed moods, and so we want to see that. But we're willing to go either way on that. We're open to it. I think programs and professionals that have a blanket philosophy about it, they're not paying attention to the science. It doesn't make sense to have an ideology about it in that way. Being outdoors is an incredible process. Right? Exercise, sleep, diet, all of those things we know contribute to elevated mood, to reduction in depression. So in addition to the therapy, what we do just naturally in wilderness therapy does so much to help people with depression. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a very common one. Dialectical behavioral therapy, managing self-harm, we'll talk about that tonight. Learning distress tolerance techniques, adopting a radical acceptance and a mindfulness practice are important parts of that. All of those are parts of dialectical behavioral therapy. Learning new communication, assertiveness training. I'm going to talk a few times about the door out of depression, and I think this is difficult for people because the door out of depression oftentimes is anger and sadness. Meaning that if depression isn't sadness, by the way. Depression is an absence of energy, motivation, feeling even. It's a numbness. It's a dark, overwhelming cloud. So it's not sadness. Sadness brings tears and hurt and anguish. And in mental health, we think about being able to move through that in a process. But depression is a stuckness. It's an absence of something in a lot of ways. And so sometimes the way out of depression is to grieve, to feel sadness. Sometimes it's anger. Depression is like an anger directed inward. I'll talk about that with some of the dynamics tonight. So if you can turn that energy outward, and it's not going to be elegant all the time. But as parents, for those of us who have a difficult time tolerating anger or manifestations of anger, it can be very challenging for us, for those of us who have a difficult time with that. But sometimes that's, again, the escape route out of it. And if a person isn't allowed to feel angry, if it's not welcomed or accepted in any way, the solution is depression. The solution is that I'm just going to block up everything. Depression is like a dam, right? It's like damming up a river to create a lake or reservoir. And you can't just let the happy feelings through. If you dam up the river, all the water gets blocked. So to get out of that, you're going to have a range of emotions, much of which are going to be in the area of anger that's going to come out of that. Exercise and diet, I talked about that. Sleep also. Also, we know that exposure to screens has the effect on the brain to cause anxiety and depression. Also, exposure to social media. So there's a lot of things that wilderness therapy does naturally. That's why I think there's becoming in our culture less resistance to the idea of wilderness therapy, because I think it's becoming obvious to everybody that doing therapy outdoors makes sense. And now that the model is so clinical and safe and multifaceted, meaning that we have psychiatric services, we have a mind-body health, mind-body-spirit curriculum, all of that, a mindfulness component to it. Now that we have all of that, I think more people, even psychiatrists and people that haven't been fans in the past, are understanding that it's really a fantastic delivery method for therapy. So again, a lot of the question becomes, is this normal? Is this, a lot of times people confuse depression and anxiety together, or bipolar together. And so getting a diagnosis, getting testing can be helpful for that. But also being in an environment like you've chosen to send your child, in an environment where you really do have a sterile, psychologically speaking, a sterile environment. You have fantastic observation. Right? The daily living exposes what's going on in the individual. And the outside noise and distractions are limited and mitigated significantly. So in family work, we talk about identifying the primary and secondary gains. Right? What is the child getting out of the behavior? I remember studying in college 25 years ago, learning about how in families where there's a depressed individual and people begin to overfunction, to coddle, to rescue, that it feeds and contributes and polarizes the depression. And so a lot of family interventions are to pull back, right? And that's not a surprise to anybody. A lot of the issues that children suffer from that come to evoke for, a lot of the work for parents is the same. Pulling back, healthy detachment, healthy consistent boundaries, healthy communication. There's a lot of similarities there. But it helps to know that sometimes the cyclical pattern that goes on in relationships, where we actually inadvertently reinforce behaviors and issues that we don't want to reinforce. So we talk about that. Blocking changing patterns. Learning to take ownership of your piece of it. A lot of parents want their children to develop more accountability. I think universally that's probably true. One of the best ways to encourage accountability is to be accountable for your piece. Model it. Even if yours is only 10% of it, 2% of it. If it's 2% of it, it ought to be, ideally, theoretically, easier to own. And you wouldn't say it's just 2%. You would say, yes, I contribute to this piece of it. So that's one of the most powerful ways of inhibiting or discouraging, in terms of reinforcement theory, discouraging issues moving forward. Learning to differentiate yourself. Learning to understand where you stop and I start. What's mine? What are my emotions? What's yours? That is an important piece. Communication theory, cognitive behavioral ideas are really important in this process. Learning as a parent to let them struggle, to let them suffer pain when it hurts, that it's okay. And I'll tell you, we do so much as parents and as people, don't we, that suggests to other people, don't feel what you're feeling. We do it so consistently. That's why in my book and in my work, so often I ask people, and then therapy does this, to pause and say, why are you saying that? What's your intention here? And the answer solves it. Right? Learning to ask yourself the question, even just pausing somebody in a family session and saying, why are you saying this? And oftentimes the first answer is, well, I just want to explain this. Why do you want to explain this? I'll follow up. And after 2 or 3 or 4 questions, we often get to, well, I don't want them to feel bad. I don't want them to feel upset. I don't want them to be angry. Or I want them to understand this idea, this thing, this motive, this other side of things, so they're not upset. So we learn in communication theory, we learn in therapy, we learn by interrupting these patterns to let people struggle, be upset, be sad, happy, scared, anxious, grieve, angry, whatever it is. Learning to lean into it. Stop trying to control or manage it. It feeds a learned helplessness in the other person. I had a client recently identify this pattern in her family where she recognized that everybody trying to help her all the time suggested to her that she couldn't do anything. She had this unconscious experience around her family that she was impotent, incapable, because of the constant rescuing. Like I talked about, stop trying to convince them that you are good, right, fair, not me, whatever it is. Whatever you're trying to get them to think about you, let go of that. Right? Children need, it's healthy differentiation. It's rational and reasonable behavior for them to feel upset about you, to you, and what you've done. And if they can't, if for whatever reason they're not allowed to feel that, and most likely it's to protect your ego, and all of this is unconscious, of course, then something's wrong with them. That anger goes inward. And in love, we think about love in terms of an action. It's something that we learn to hold them with positive regard, with compassion, with patience. That's this work that we do. That's why we offer so much family work and support. Giving you the webinars, the podcasts, giving you what we give you, the assignments, the readings. It's not to fix you because you're crazy. It's to give you stuff to fill you up, to change your ears and eyes, so that you have greater capacity around your children. And you can never have enough. You can never have enough because needs are limitless. And learning, I think in the early days, I've said this many times over the years, the first thing I learned as a wilderness therapist in 1996 was that children were much stronger, much more resilient than they or their parents believed. And so treating them like they're strong, treating them like they're capable. And I know there's a lot of criticism in our culture these days of parents, and I'm not a fan of it. And there is something we do when we think that we can inject them with feeling good about themselves. Like, I can make you feel good about yourself. I'm going to make that my project. There's something about that process, and I think many of us understand it and can see it in ourselves at times. There's something about that process that suggests to the child that they're fragile. More important, more effective, with greater long-term effects is learning to listen and see them. Less is more often when it comes to praise. Praise effort, but don't praise outcomes. And when a child is feeling bad about themselves, don't tell them how great they are. Empathize. Listen to the sadness. It doesn't work to simply try to paint an emotional whitewash over. It doesn't work to try to just cover it up with praise. It's not the solution. The opposite is the solution. Well, not quite the opposite, but something that seems like the opposite, which is to get into the hole, get under the bus with them. Understand how they feel. Be curious. That's what it means to be curious. I want to understand what it's like for you. And saying, I don't understand you, isn't trying to understand them. It's a shaming message. I don't understand you, or why do they do this? When it's not asked as a question, when it's repeated over and over again, is saying, you're crazy. What you're thinking and feeling doesn't make sense. And by the way, telling somebody they're crazy, even if they are, isn't the solution to them not being crazy. It perpetuates it. So the curiosity that we get is, I want to understand. I want to see it as best as I can through your eyes. I want to see it until it makes sense to me. That's why I say over the years, when parents say, I don't understand why my child does this, I try to explain it. Try to explain it as clearly as I can, as well as I understand it. Take my best guesses, apply what I know from my theory and my practice, and explain that to the parents. But after a while, when that comes back again, I don't understand him or her. My response to the parent is, figure it out. Figure it out. It's your job to understand. So you've got to figure out how this makes sense to them. Why what they're doing, how it makes sense in a certain context. Self-harm. Oftentimes it's cutting. It can be more superficial scratches, embedding objects in yourself, in your sexual in your for girls, they might do it in their sexual organs or in their anus for boys and for girls. So we have children do that. It can seem quite disturbing to most people when we talk about self-harm, things that people are willing to do. We've had students who've tried to burn themselves, of course, um, hitting themselves, hitting objects, not attending. We've had children pick scabs, right? Chew on their fingers, intentionally not attend to hygiene in order to develop sores. Um, and ingesting objects, rocks. We've had children swallow rocks, metal objects, things like that. Those are some examples of self-harm. We don't include piercing and tattoo in these categories when we're talking about it. I think a lot of people might make that connection. We don't identify them as such in our culture today. So why do people self-harm? The primary gain is it's a numbing, right? It's an emotional numbing. If I can focus on the cut, the wound, then I don't have to focus on the emotional pain, which is unbearable, which is worse, which is a trap. For some, it's soothing to self-harm, right? There's something about it that's congruent with the way that they're feeling. And for some, it's even a rush, a dopamine rush for them, right? There's a hormonal response to it that is a pleasure to them. Distracting or escape. In this one, this is important in terms of the parental response or the therapeutic response. The distracting escape is not just the fact that you're focusing on a cut instead of thinking about or feeling something difficult, but you change the discussion. If symptoms, including substance abuse, eating disorders, self-harm, if symptoms become the focus, then they're working. They're working to distract everybody from what's really going on inside, which is some kind of emotional disturbance, right? So that's why we talk about this idea in therapy is to not talk about symptoms, to not focus on symptom reduction. It's, therapy, there's a lot of different specific tools in therapy and theories. But for the most part, therapy is about getting at what the wound is underneath the symptom. And if we talk about how much weight you're losing, and if we obsess about that, power struggle about that, we never get to talk about how you're feeling. And so much of therapy is talking about your feelings. For some, it's feeling something because they become so numb that there's just a feeling. So I want to feel something. Because again, depression, remember, is not a sadness simply. It's an absence of feeling. And then there's a sense of control over things, right? So much is about trauma and about something, trauma. One of the core threads that runs through all trauma is it got done to me, right? I didn't choose what was done. It was outside of my control, and this is something that I can control. Secondary gains include it communicates. It's the old adage of it's a cry for help. The projective identification is of I'm going to be helpless, I'm going to be powerless, you've got to save me. Right? You're my rescuer. I'm going to get into a relationship with you where I become absolutely impotent and then you take over. I'm going to exaggerate what I'm experiencing on the inside and create it on the outside. In some ways, it puts distance between the child and the parent because the parent it's so unnatural to so many parents that it's like the kind of music that young people listen to each generation, the way that they dress, their jargon. It's another way of creating distance between them and their parents and kind of a pseudo differentiation. And it's a passive attack on parents, right? Instead of expressing anger at you, I'm going to hurt the thing that you love the most in the world, which is me, your child. So again, if we can turn that anger outward, Sometimes it starts off as an uncontrolled outward expression, but eventually help them to express it more elegantly, more clearly. Then they don't have to go inward at themselves. And for some of them, it's about self-hatred, right? And they've learned self-hatred because they've learned from their environment, from their world, on Facebook, friends, socially, family, that I'm not okay. Who I am is not okay. I'm bad. And that's why it's important to be careful as parents with putting our feelings on them, because if they are causing us to be miserable, that's a horrible place to be. If I'm causing the people that love me most on the planet to be miserable, I've got to be bad, and I've got to be punished for that. What are some signs that it might be happening? Because long sleeves at inappropriate times, it's a very common sign. They'll just find ways to do it in places that you can't see. A lot of times it's right in the upper inner thigh, because parents don't view that area. Unexplained or odd explanations for wounds, especially consistently. Bloody tissues, towels, clothes in their bathroom, in the hamper, in various places. The tolerance and escalation, meaning that they usually start off light. They usually don't start off with some of the severe examples that I give, and they begin to escalate. So by the time that you become aware of it, they've been doing it for quite some time. People that the research suggests to us that people that demonstrate self-harm, while it's not lethal in and of itself, it's a profile that suggests that they're much, much more likely to be suicidal. And then look for items. If you find razors, sometimes that can be other things, but if you find razors or sharp objects hidden somewhere, then you can be suspicious of it. The lethality of it. It's not necessarily suicidal, although, like I just read, it can be an indication of a profile that is prone to suicide. It can escalate. It has an addictive nature in it that individuals build a tolerance. And again, that pleasure response from the brain. Just think of the fact that the adolescent brain is considered typically between 12 and 25. The adolescent brain, the pleasure center in the brain, requires a lot more stimulation than the adult brain. And so they're much more prone to addictive behaviors because of that. So it can cause an escalation. It can cause, just like drug abuse, substance abuse, it can cause an escalation. It is very much like substance abuse, because in many ways it's inducing the same result: numbness, escape, pleasure. And of course, they can make a mistake. People that are self-harming and participate in high-risk behaviors can make a mistake and put their life at risk. It's not necessarily intent to suicide, but it can result in it sometimes. The common thread between self-harm and suicide is escape. Same with substance abuse. Self-harm, dangerous activities, reckless behavior, and suicide all have the common themes of escape and danger to self. So, this is one of those areas where professional response is incredibly important and helpful. I don't know a parent, including myself, who is able to manage their responses to this without a trauma response. Because there's nothing more unnatural and frightening than to watch your child trying to hurt themselves. So do your best to have as calm of a reaction as possible, as curious a reaction as possible. Get outside help as soon as possible. Not because it's a desperate situation, but because you're not engineered as a mother and a father to be able to respond in a way that can be helpful. And a lot of times that's true for me and for you. Again, you welcome the disclosure, the discovery, because it tells you something about them. I've said this on webinars before to illustrate this point, and I hope it makes sense. When I see a child in my program, in my practice, hurting themselves, I have a fundamentally different response than their parent. I have a response where I often, my instinct is, this is a deep and rich person. right? They're full of feeling and full of depth and passion, and there's fantastic potential for them in life. I anticipate them giving back wonderful things to the world. Right? That's part of my response to it. That wouldn't be my response if I found it on my child. It would be simply scary. So you want to do the best you can to avoid powerfully charged emotional reactions. Those aren't helpful. They actually, in many ways, are the secondary gain that the child is looking for. Reassure them and affirm them that you'll work with them. Let them know that that you have they have your attention and your support in the process. Realizing that it is a deceptive game that is played often, it's going to be important that you are vigilant about it. And again, if you're getting outside help like you are in our program, that's one way to make sure that they're protected. What are the consequences? You're going to do something to put them in a situation where they're going to be safe. That's what you're going to do. That's what some of you did by sending your child to Evoke and in subsequent programs. You're going to develop compassion, develop communication that you haven't had before, and understanding that you haven't had before. Anger is not a helpful response, pragmatically speaking. I'm not telling you not to be angry. I'm telling you need to go somewhere to take care of that. It can operate like an addiction, and they won't likely know how to stop. This is not easy to stop. It's compulsive for many of them. So again, interrupting it in a setting like Evoke can be very valuable in the process, and it's not something that promises are going to simply work on, and they'll make a lot of promises like other compulsive behaviors. Learn to listen rather than talk. That's the most important thing. Themes often include not feeling understood by others, not feeling invisible and alone, a lack of connection, feeling powerless, impotent, and helpless. Ask as many open-ended questions as you can. Be curious, not yes or no, not leading questions. And find a way to validate. That just means find a way to figure out how it makes sense, because it does. It makes sense in some context. Whether that context is distorted or not isn't the point. In some context, it makes perfect, rational sense. Like I said, I was going to talk about self-sabotage in general, and I changed the topic to suicide tonight, and I realized, like I said at the beginning, like the outset, I can't really do it justice. So I'm not going to talk, I'm really not, and I apologize in a way that I don't have words for. If any of you have a loved one who has taken their own life, that's something that is not going to be covered on a webinar well. But I can talk about those of you who are struggling with a child who has threatened or attempted it, and to talk about how to deal with it in that aspect. One of the questions I get often is it real or manipulation? We treat it like it's real all the time. You don't have the luxury to treat it like it's manipulation, right? We take it at face value. And even like I said before, people manipulating can be successful with suicide. They can make a mistake and end up losing their life. So why do they do it? They do it like the other reasons we were talking about tonight, to escape the pain. They do it because it's the ultimate disappearance. Shame is an energy that says, I need to go away. I'm the problem. I'm a burden. I'm unlovable, unlikable. And so the solution is, if I go away, it will be better for other people. There's a double bind to suicidality, which means I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't. Simply put, and this is going to be an overgeneralization, one of the dynamics I see with depressed students who fantasize about suicide, depressed clients who fantasize about it in this program, is if they are angry with their parents, it's going to go horribly for them. And so they turn that anger inward, and it's horrible for them. Right? If I express my true self, maybe that's being gay or transgender. If I express my true self, the reaction from my context, whatever that means, is going to be unbearable. If I deny who I am because of that, it's unbearable. So there are a lot of double binds in suicide. And that's why one of the most helpful things I ever heard when I was going through a rough, dark time in my life was from my therapist when she said, I wasn't suicidal, but I at times I just wish I would die. I wouldn't be active about it, but it felt like that's what I wanted. And she said something very simple and profound to me that I'll never forget, that I've repeated for years now. She said, you're making a mistake like a lot of people who fantasize about dying or suicide or attempt it. And that is that all of you doesn't need to die. Part of the self needs to die. There's a part of you need to let go of and kill off. It might be the belief that you need to make somebody happy. It might be the belief that it's not okay to be angry. Or you need to be a certain way to be loved or acceptable. Or you're responsible for other people's feelings. Or other people's opinions of you mean something. Right? Whatever it is. If you can let go of that piece, you're free. And I know for me, in my work as a client, that the times in my life I've been able to kill parts of myself off, it's been the most amazing joy in the world. And well, I don't know that if I've ever qualified for being depressed. There certainly have been times in my life where there was a dark cloud, and the cloud's lifted. As a parent, you do whatever you can. You do whatever you can because if the unthinkable happens, you have to know that you've done everything that you can. And a lot of parents get to the point where they're able to detach because they come to realize they can't win this game. They can't prevent it. You know, parents ask, how can you detach from this one? I don't know that you fully can. If this happens in your life, it's a wound from which you will never fully recover. It will always impact you. Some people, I've talked to people about this, and some people become activists, right? They turn it into something else. I just spoke in New York a couple of weeks ago, and the opening speaker, I was speaking about drugs and how to talk to your children about drugs, and the opening speaker was a rabbi man, a Jewish man, who was sharing about his son's death and overdose in public, in the newspaper, and was making it his life's goal to educate people about substance use in his community. So I know other people who have done that. They've made it their mission. They've turned it into something else. That's one of the ways that people cope with it. And I was working with a parent this weekend, and it was incredibly profound because she has a child, a young adult child, who's attempted suicide many times, threatens it if she doesn't get her way. Some of the threats, some of the attempts have been recent, been hospitalized several times, and this mother's been working incredible, so has the father, I'm sure. And I know he has. And she got to the point, it was amazingly powerful, profound, and clear. And she said, I can't stop her. I can only find my truth and express it. I can only love and care for myself and for her. That's all I can do. And she's tried everything she knows. And she's come to realize that, and she's swung the whole pendulum, right? The whole continuum from completely ridiculous enabling to, kicking the child essentially out of her house. And she's realized with all that she's tried to do and all the work that she's done, and she's done tremendous work, that she can only do what she can do. And so she's learned, like somebody who's working on their codependency, she's learned that her job is to find her truth and express it. And you can see the soberness in her work and the seriousness. So we learn to challenge our initial self, our reaction to things. We learn to challenge our instinctual, knee-jerk, reflexive response to things. Depression, self-harm, suicide, threats, so forth. We learn to do that in this work. And when we learn to do that and pull that apart, we learn to disrupt patterns of unconscious reinforcement. That is to say, We stop reinforcing things that we don't want to reinforce when we challenge our reactions, when we ask ourselves why again and again and again. And we become more mindful in this practice, right? Part of my work as a therapist is I'm thinking about what I'm doing in a session, in a relationship, and I'm developed that practice. I've developed an intentionality about it, and that helps me to stop negative interactions, non-helpful interactions. Go to therapy and go to support groups for family members who suffer from self-harm, suicidality. If you've experienced it, go. The most important thing, I remember when I was going through a really traumatic experience last year, 1.5 years ago, I called somebody that wasn't my closest friend. My wife and I both experienced it at the same time, and we were driving home from this place because we had arrived in separate cars. And as we were driving home, I called a friend, not my best friend, but I called a friend, and I called a friend because I knew his brother and his father had had the same experience, the same difficulty. And he said something. I didn't even know why I called him. I just thought he knows it. And he said something that was the thing I needed to hear. And he said he loved me, and he said, I just want you to know you're not alone. And it's what I needed. That's really what we need as humans. We need to not be alone in this. And because of our shame, we separate ourselves from everybody else. Right? And if we allowed ourselves, if we could get past that shame, we would realize that it is our pain that connects us so much. And it's in our pain that we need each other. And we need our connection. So go to places where people have experienced similar things. It's very important. Come to our parent meetings if you can. If it's in your area, go to Al-Anon, go to CODA, go to support groups, go to NAMI.org. Find classes and other people who have gone through it. For depressed people, learn to exercise. Learn that you can't cut out sadness and not lose happiness. You can't. You can't cut out the negative feelings and keep the positive ones. They're tied together. It's okay to take a vacation from your problem when your child is safe. It's okay to take care of yourself. Practice self-care, both literal and metaphorical vacations from the process. I hope it was helpful. I'm happy to take any questions if any have come in. Is having a child that tests positive for drugs but behaves more depressed than numb than a drug addict? It is better to get the help for them they need with antidepressants and therapy as the punishment of consequence, rather than the old school take away the car, phone privileges. You know, I think there's a few problems with punishment. But we shouldn't throw punishment in the garbage. It has its place. The problem with punishment is it's a negative, undesired consequence for a behavior that we want to see go away, right? So it's a stimulus to try to decrease behavior that we don't like or that is unhealthy or inappropriate, whatever it is. It's got two problems to it. Number one, it doesn't tell the person what to do. Okay? Number two, it can be fueled by anger. Right? It can get bigger than it needs to be. It can be kind of this is too strong of a word almost, but kind of a revenge thing. Like it's cathartic for me to punish my children. I've done a webinar on using punishment, using behaviorism. I don't think we throw it out, but just like in my chapter in my book on behavioral reinforcement, the very first line is spend time understanding and learning what the behavior is telling you before you try to get rid of it. And also, my idea as a therapist, I'm not a medical doctor, I can't prescribe medication. My idea of a therapist is if a person can make adequate progress with therapeutic techniques, there's no need to introduce medication. If they are unable to or significantly hampered in their access to therapy techniques, interventions, then use medication. Get them to a doctor who can prescribe medication. So I think this is a very great question and a complicated one, because all the things that you've written are on the table. All the things you've written are on the table. Any other questions? All right. If there are any, after I go through my upcoming announcement slides, I'll take any at the very end. Our next workshop that we want all current families to go to in Southern Utah is January 20th and 29th. We'd love it. People love it. Multifamilies, psychoeducation, this connection that I'm talking about. We might have a spot left in the February Finding You, but we might run out. So you'd have to come to the next intensive in March. I'll get some more on the calendar for April and May here in this next week. These are 6 people. I run them, cabin in Park City, very deep personal work. Some really powerful work. We just finished one this weekend. Every time I experience it, I can't believe how amazing these are, and everybody gets what they needed out of it. And it's different for everybody. We want every parent, we ask you to try 6 support groups while you're with us. 6 12-step support groups. Either Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Nar-Anon, or Alateen, or any combination of those. You can go to the websites of those various programs and find meetings. Also, you can go to NAMI.org for classes, groups, and other support and education. Remember, coming up, we have the Los Angeles parent meeting on the 29th. That's a potluck followed by a parent meeting. Please RSVP to Stephanie at evoketherapy.com. And then on January 31st, in the Bay Area, we moved it across the Bay. So we're at the San Francisco Airport Marriott in San Mateo. And that's 7 to 9 on January 31st. Follow us on social media. If you have social media, follow us. You get a lot of announcements. Sometimes email can block something out. It can go to a junk file or you might miss it. So follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Also, all of our webinars are being transferred to podcasts. So if you want to listen to them on the go, finally, on your iPhone or other device, you can go to the podcast app on your iPhone or the SoundCloud app on your Android device. And then, of course, the Evoke Therapy blog is there. We have a pursuits program which can be customized and individualized. High adventure. It can be as few as one person to a father and son we had one time, to a family, to a group of young people. We have some scheduled ones for young adults. Think of it as therapy light or refresher or sober fun. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon, or there's an audio version there too. Go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page on Amazon to order books recommended by our therapists, and a percentage of the proceeds go to charity to help people who can't afford therapy. Any last questions before? No last questions. All right. I don't have a topic for next week. I'm open to suggestions. If you have them, you can email webinar@drbradreedy.com if you want to make suggestions or have any questions. But it will be Monday, January 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Hope these broadcasts are helpful to you. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you after the weekend. Bye-bye.